Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Stephanie Kane.
Hi there! How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you so much for coming on. And for our listeners who have not listened to the previous episode, you can go back and listen to that because this is my second time having Stephanie on, and I am so excited to have her. So, can you tell me about your newest book?
Well, my newest book is a true crime book called Cold Case Story, and it's coming out March 1st, and it's unlike anything else I've ever written. I've written a couple of, as you know from interviewing me earlier, I've written a couple of genre series, legal thrillers, and a mystery series with an art conservator heroine. But this is a total departure for that. It's written in first person, and as I said, it's a true crime book, and it's very personal for me. It's the true story of the murder of a Denver area housewife named Betty Fry in 1973. And it's personal because Betty was murdered on the eve of my marriage to her son. So back in 1973, I was one of the last people to speak to Betty on the day she was killed. And a few hours later, I was one of the first people to see her killer. So, as if that wasn't strange enough, almost 30 years later, in 2001, I wrote my very first mystery novel. It was a standalone book called Quiet Time. And it was a highly fictionalized version of Betty's murder. And then, if that wasn't strange enough, 4 years later, in 2005, Quiet Time, the mystery novel, actually became instrumental in reopening Betty's murder as a cold case. So what Cold Case Story does is it wraps all of those three strands together and recounts it as, the true story of a housewife's death and what happened afterwards.
Yeah, and I started reading it, and I absolutely love how it's formatted, too, where it's like, okay, here are the facts, here's everything that happened, and, how it really knits everything together, like what you said.
That's exactly what I was trying to do, to weave the strands together and keep the momentum going.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this book is not fictionalized, right?
No, this is actually the book I wish I could have written when I wrote Quiet Time. The reason I wrote Quiet Time, which, as I said, was the very first book I ever wrote, was because for 30 years, Betty's murder just kind of ate away at me. Yeah. I married her son. We were married for 9 years, and nobody ever talked about her murder. And I should say, the killer was her husband, who became my father-in-law.
Oh.
Yes, because
Oh, boy. I was not expecting
I hope
that.
I didn't spoil it for you.
I have not gotten to that point yet.
Well, you see, this is why it's so personal for me.
Yeah.
And I became, I was a member of their family, for almost 10 years after it happened. And nobody, he was charged with murder. The charges were dropped for reasons we were never told back then. And he basically walked. But, the crime had a profound effect on my husband, on me, other people in the family, and yet nobody would talk about it. So for, all those years, because of the timing of her murder, I felt like our impending marriage might have been a catalyst, might have somehow disrupted a fragile balance in that family. So I felt guilty about the whole thing, and I had no access to the facts or anything, but I had very strong memories of what happened that day and afterwards. And so to sort of exorcise my own ghosts, I wrote it and then just gradually fictionalized it more and more and more. Mm-hmm. And then it got published as as pure fiction, a mystery story by Bantam.
Oh my goodness. So when it was initially published, did it say anywhere like that you had this connection to the story, or?
Yeah, I was totally frank with Bantam about my connection. And they made me change a lot of things about Quiet Time. They made me move the timeline up 10 years. They made me change. I couldn't have any references to Colorado in the book.
Yeah.
And it was, of course, set in the Denver area. They made me change Denver to Widmark and Boulder to Stanley and, things like that. And by then it was a totally fictionalized story because, it had to have an ending. And in real life, at that point, it had not had an ending. So I had to make up, the plot. And what happened is in 2005, 4 years after the book came out, the killer's sister, who was by then, I think, 78 years old, happened to be watching TV late at night, and there was a late night rerun of, me being interviewed on a TV show that had been canceled. I mean, it was a public TV show and it had lost its funding and it had been canceled, and it was like 4 years later, and she saw me interviewed, and something, even though I did not breathe a word, I did not make any suggestion that it had anything to do with real life. In fact, I published it. The reason I write under the name Kane, my last name, my pen name, is because it's my second husband's name. And I adopted that pen name to make it even more unrecognizable, that Quiet Time had anything to do with real life. But nevertheless, she recognized me, and she went out and bought the book. She read it, and she had kind of a crisis of conscience, and she came forward with a confession that her brother had made.
Oh my gosh.
And that reopened the murder case. And then all of a sudden I was a witness, and that started, a whole other, chain of events.
Yeah, I just cannot imagine. I was about to say, this is the kind of thing that should go in a book, and then I realized that it did.
It is.
In two.
Yes. Cold case story.
Yes, go buy it, everyone. Please do. Wow. What was it like fictionalizing events that were not just real life, but events that you lived through and that you, not played a role in, but you know what I mean? You were there.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was, Quiet Time was the fictionalization of it, and it was sort of my laboratory for teaching myself how to write fiction. I'd never taken a creative writing course or anything, and I started out, without any intention of it being a book or publishing it or anything. I started out writing it in the first-person voices of 20 different people. And the reason I was doing that is because I was trying to exorcise my own ghosts, and to do that, I was trying to imagine what other people involved might have been feeling or thinking, Yeah. I mean, I didn't even really have a story. I just had, these voices of people who were real, but I was, imagining what they were thinking because I had no way of being in their head. And that was the first few drafts. And then it went through more than 20 drafts. And each one was more highly fictionalized as I gradually learned, the craft of plotting a story and creating characters. And, there was a love interest and a good cop. And, all these things were fiction. So, and then, of course, when Bantam entered the picture, by then it wasn't a real story to me at all. It was just, it was a mystery story, but I felt like I owed it to them, certainly, to tell them the origins. And then their legal team read it and, came up with, I don't know, a whole bunch of things that they wanted me to change so that it would be even less recognizable. So I was fictionalizing real life events and ones that I had lived through, but by the time it became, out on the bookshelf, it was just totally fiction. I mean, I had made so much of it up that, it was no longer my personal catharsis. It was hopefully an entertaining mystery.
Yeah. When you started A Quiet Time, did you know that it would eventually get published, or were you hoping that it would get published, or was it mostly just a way of, exorcising these ghosts?
It was totally to exorcise the ghosts. Totally. But what happens? You start to show drafts to people, and they say, "Oh, this is good. You should get it published."
Mm-hmm.
Without knowing anything about the origin of the story, and you start to think, maybe I could turn this into an entertaining novel. And then you realize that you're like right at the bottom of the learning curve in terms of how to write a fiction story. And so you start learning that, and you get more excited each time you learn something new and you apply it to the current draft. And, and then at a certain point, somebody says, you really ought to think about trying to, get this published. This is a fun story. And that's what happened, but that was years. I mean, I started researching it for real and writing it as a catharsis in the early 1990s when I remarried. And, I told my husband what had happened, and he said, that's an interesting story, but why were the charges dropped? And so I did as much research as I could into it, and, did not have any way to access what really had happened. I just got, the court, I went to the old courthouse and, got the old file out of the archives, and they copied it for me. And that gave me a little more information. And then I just, tried to exorcise it. So I had no, it went through, I guess what I'm trying to say is it went through a very long process.
Yeah.
And it was really the process of my becoming a writer, and at the end of that process, it became publishable. But it certainly was not how it originated or what I ever expected to happen. I got more excited about the writing than the story, because as I wrote it out, I was exorcising those demons with each draft. I got more and more acceptance of what had happened, even though I did not have anything like the facts that I had by the time I wrote Cold Case Story, because by then it had been through, years and years of cold case proceedings in which I was a witness. And when it was all over, I was able to obtain the official police files from, the first investigation of the murder in 1973 and the reinvestigation and reprosecution in 2005. So I had thousands and thousands of pages of witness interviews from, back then when I was a member of the family, and, and wondering what else was happening. All of a sudden I had all of that. And plus the overlay of what happened in 2005, when there was more witness stuff and more forensics, and, plus I got crime scene photos and, all kinds of things, and audio tapes. Oh. Those were really, really hard to listen to, because I hadn't had any contact with anybody in that family by then it was 30 years, but I recognized them. I could picture them as they were speaking, and it was very freaky and, kind of gut-wrenching.
Yeah, I can just imagine, having to go through that, having this story where you're connected to it, but there's also that disconnect there,
Yeah, and wow. It was really personal, because by then they really hated me. Because it turns out that, again, this is spoiler alert, but what I had most feared was actually true. that the wedding had played some role in what happened. That was in the confession. So it was like not just revisiting all these people who were part of a part of my life that, I had hoped was in my past, but, just having sort of my worst fears back then confirmed, and then having them hate me because I'd written Quiet Time, which had, made their father be reindicted and, started the whole thing up over again. So it was really a very heavy experience emotionally. And I didn't write anything for the 8 years during which the cold case was going on. I just did not. It just froze me completely. It paralyzed me.
I can imagine. Yeah.
I'd sort of been mid-career as a writer when this happened. And then I just went, completely off the deep end in terms of, not writing and not having anything come out.
Well, it's such a heavy experience. And it's so, traumatic and everything that you're describing, going through all these court proceedings and stuff. Oh.
But you know what? It was also really good because it made me face things about myself, and it forced me to look at myself and to accept what I had done. Back in 1973, when I had entered that family, and then in 2001, when I had fictionalized them for a murder mystery, and then, confronting them in a courtroom. I mean, it's sort of like, they used to have an old TV show, I can't remember what its name was, but it's something like This Is Your Life, and, somebody would come out from the wings and it would be like your worst enemy, from grade school or something, or, an old boyfriend you jilted, 50 years ago, and, and that was sort of what this was like, like a replay of the worst moments of each of these decades of my life. And yet, you emerge from it and you're a stronger person because you look at what you did and you say, I can live with what I did. I didn't do it for a bad reason and never wanted to hurt anybody, And
you just got married. It's not like...
Yeah, I know. I mean, ultimately, it's not... I didn't kill her. I mean, that's the, the long and the short of it. So, I could live with my role in it and whether that had destabilized that family. What it really made me want to do once my worst fears were realized, and then when my hands were untied after the case was over and I could, get all the files and records and stuff, is it really made me want to understand what else was going on in that family, because I knew it wasn't just me. It couldn't possibly be, just me. No. And so I went out and I interviewed witnesses, and a lot of them were in their 80s by then. And the ones I spoke to wanted to talk about it. Because one thing that people don't usually understand or have no reason to know about cold cases is that, what people really want is to know what happened. The thing that gnaws at you is, just not knowing what happened. And for Cold Case Story, I did interview a few experts because I wanted to understand to the fullest extent that I could what had happened and all the dimensions of it. And one person I interviewed was a guy named Howard Morton, who had founded, he was in his 80s, and he had founded an organization called FOVAMP, Families of Victims of Homicides and Missing Persons. And what it is a cold case families, survivors sort of advocacy group.
Yeah.
And he had founded it with his wife because their eldest son had been murdered in Arizona in 1986, I think. And that case was unsolved. So Howard and his wife had founded this organization. So he just, he founded it and brought it to a certain level of prominence, and then he retired. And I asked him, I said, well, what is it that cold case families are looking for? Is it, first of all, I said, is it closure? And he got really mad at me, and he said, that word is, that very word is an insult to the families of cold case victims, because it's a wound that never heals, so you can never have closure. So I said to him, well, is acceptance a better word? And he agreed that that was a better word. But I said to him, so what is it that cold case families are looking for? And I said, is it, justice? Is it revenge? No, what is it that you want? And he said that, speaking for him and his wife and most of the people he had worked with, all they wanted to know was what happened.
Yeah.
They didn't want to see, somebody strung up, they wanted to know what happened. And sort of that's what drove me for decades. So I understood it, because if you don't know what happened, you start to question yourself. Did I really see these things that I thought I saw? Did they mean what I think they meant? What is my responsibility in this? And you just don't know. So it becomes this really corrosive thing, apart from mourning the person who died and all that. It just that the not knowing makes it really impossible to accept and move on.
Yeah. And that can really be applied to any area, like anything that's left unresolved. It's like that sense of you can never really get that closure because it's shocking.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, it applies in all kinds of ways in your life, and and then the other thing about cold case families is, they've gotten a lot of attention lately with the DNA databasing and stuff like that, the DNA genealogy and all that, which is terrific, But most cold case victims, families, for most cold case victims, I should say, at least most of the ones that Howard worked with, and I think this is probably true, across the board, they're not famous people. They're not victims of serial killers. They're housewives or, people who don't normally get a lot of attention from the police. And so resources aren't put into them. And I remember, as part of my research, I attended like a cold case seminar that was put on by a police department and a district attorney's office. And there were all these people in the audience who had family members murdered at one time or another with absolutely no resolution. And they were asking questions like, my heart went out to them, because I knew, at least by then, that, if you want to find out some answers, you file an Official Records Act request, I couldn't do that while the cold case was pending because I was a witness, and you don't want to have your testimony tainted by, facts that you didn't observe, You can't talk to other witnesses for the same reason. So my hands were tied for a long time. But I had some idea of how you could go about researching this stuff. And most of the people in the audience had no idea that they had the right, to file a records request of their police department or their prosecutor's office, and that they would have to turn over the case file,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people out there who just, are walking around and they're looking for answers, and they have no way of getting them, or, they don't realize they have a way of getting them.
And hopefully parts of your book, like when you talk about getting the records and that sort of thing, can show people that there are ways.
Yeah, I hope so.
Hopefully it will give them a sense of more acceptance, or not closure, I'm trying to not use that.
Yeah,
piece,
no,
you know?
yeah. There was a person actually who contacted me after reading my blog who was trying to find out information about, a family member who had been murdered in her family, like 40 years earlier. And I touched on this a little bit in the blog, which is why she contacted me. And I sent her my file, what I had on that murder. And I gave her some advice, on how she could get, the official records, since she was a family member.
Yeah. Wow.
So, that was another person who had been haunted for 30 or 40 years,
Yeah, this kind of thing it's so horrifying. And wow, I'm just kind of in shock over here listening all about this. It's so fascinating to hear about, like, the things that you can do, like, to get more information and stuff. And
then there are people who don't want it coming out. Mm-hmm. The family did not want the killer re-prosecuted. At least, his immediate family. I mean, his sister came forward with his confession, so... But
also, in that case, it was a family member, too, so, like...
I think sometimes when it's a family member, other people don't want it. They've come to terms with it in whatever way they have, or they don't want to have their belief in that person destroyed.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, that was one of the things that drove me to do all this research before I decided to write the blog and then Cold Case Story, was this question that I always had. How can children line up behind one parent who's accused of killing the other? Mm-hmm. What is it that makes them want to line up behind somebody against whom there is, real evidence? And what I concluded, just on my own, this is just totally my own sense of it. It's not, I'm not a psychologist. I don't have any expertise in this. But my suspicion is that it has at least as much to do with the relationship of each of those kids to each of those parents before the murder as it does to, the murder itself. You form natural alliances and identifications, and those become part of your personality. They become part of your identity, who you are. And, no matter how old you are, I mean, unless you come to terms with yourself in certain ways, none of us wants, those foundational identifications to be, to have somebody take a wrecking ball to them.
Yeah. So you keep mentioning this blog. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, what I started to do, after the cold case was over and I got this just enormous flood of information, which I would have given my right hand for like a tiny fraction of back when I wrote Quiet Time. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden I had all this stuff. And as I was making my way through it, and it took me literally years because there were audio, I had to put it aside for a while. It was just too upsetting, all this stuff. So I started keeping a first-person journal of it, which I called my log. And they were dated entries, kind of like, a diary, as I was going through little pieces. And because I wanted some record of how this stuff was coming together with what I had remembered, how it was challenging my memory or confirming it or adding something new that I had no idea of. So because I'm the kind of writer who writes to figure out what I think, Mm-hmm. So writing is recording my thoughts as I have them is a really important part of my thought process. Not just my writing process, but my thought process. So I organized it, just this, and every night I would write in it, this is what I found out today. This makes me want to ask this person that question, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And when I was done with it, it was the first time I had written in first person about it. And so I decided that I tried to turn it into a true crime, third person narrative, like the typical true crime book. But when I wrote it in third person, it was just really flat. I had thought, well, I had my catharsis in quiet time. Why should I have to be in this book? Yeah. And of course the result was it was just dull and flat. So I put that away. And then I thought, I really want to go back to the very first drafts of Quiet Time, when I had written them from these different persons' point of view, except that was imagined, because I wasn't in those people's heads. But now, all of a sudden, I had their words. I had their audio tapes. I had their transcripts. I knew what they thought or at least I knew what they said. And so I thought that if I disciplined myself in little, 500-word sound bites, short little blog posts, I could use those voices as a springboard for a way to get into an aspect of the case. And then I could look at an aspect of the case really deeply, do a deep dive in 500 words in some aspect of the case. And I could kick them off with a quote that inspired that line of thought. So I could all of a sudden, because I just threw away, the idea of it being published. I threw away the notion of trying to force it into some kind of, standardized true crime form. And the blog just liberated me. And then I wanted to write it in first person, because the journey to finding out what happened to Betty Fry was a personal journey. And so now, because it was disciplined into these, 500-word sound bites, so I couldn't just run away with it and blather on and on and on, it was a way of focusing the story and also incorporating the voices and the perspectives of other people who knew more than I did about that particular piece of it. And, they could be in there. So that's how I got to write the blog. And then, since I'm, a novelist, I do think in terms of beginning, middle, and end. So kind of subconsciously, as I was writing the blog, I was framing it as a story, a unitary story. And then when I was done writing it, I realized that it was more like a serialized story than, isolated blog posts. So I did a little more rearranging of it. I broke it into sections with titles, which didn't at all change the chronology that I had written the posts in. And I, did an introduction, and then I did a much more complete ending that pulled back and looked at, larger things. And I also used some of the stuff from the crime scene file.
Yeah. And I love, as I mentioned earlier, how the book is formatted. In those few words, you can get so many emotions out and so many ideas out, but it's really like an exercise in writing itself, trying to convey all of that.
I'm so glad you're asking me this and that you feel that way about it, because that is exactly what I was trying to do as a writer. I was trying to challenge myself to be tightly focused with a very short number of words. Mm-hmm. How much emotion and texture I could put into each post, And so it's as I said, it's like nothing I've ever written before. And probably like nothing I'll ever write again, because, the story is just so personal and so textured over the many years and many ways I was involved in it. But, I was telling somebody the other day that this is the story that I always wanted to write. And if I never write another thing, I'm glad I wrote this. And I'm glad I ended up writing it the way I wanted it. Yeah. Because each time I tried to do it a different way, it didn't work, you know?
Yeah, and it's so, like, brave and strong of you to put this out there when it's something so personal, too. Like, just having it there. And
when you're a witness in a criminal case, and you don't have any choice, and you have to face what you did and why, you know, and articulate it, and you're cross-examined about it, it makes you come to terms with yourself pretty quick, you know? You've got no place to hide. And once you're okay with yourself, and you've been as honest as you could possibly be, and you've been attacked, you become okay with it. You know, what more am I protecting? You know?
Yeah.
I mean, there are some things in the book and in the blog that I didn't put in, but they're not things about me. They're facts and things that I found out about other people that I thought was just, you know, too personal and not my business, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're not, you know, there's a few things like that are not in there because I didn't want to exploit that stuff, you know, and it wasn't necessary for the story I wanted to tell. And I didn't want to invade, you know, people's privacy any more than had already been done and was in the record and was important for the story I was trying to tell. Which, you know, was not just the story of, you know, the tragedy of a woman's murder, but, you know, I tried to, you know, step back a bit from it a little bit and look at something a little bigger than a whodunit or the human tragedy of one woman's death. I mean, I wanted to do a larger commentary on the justice system and that overlooked dimension to cold cases that I was telling you about earlier. So, you know, I had a larger purpose at that point. And, you know, adding little details that were not relevant to that and that could only, you know, be invasive to people, you know, was not something I was ever tempted to do. So, you know, 99% of it's in there, you know,
mm-hmm.
and I didn't spare any part of my own responsibility. That I did not, you know, hold back on.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, this has been so incredible to talk to you. I've loved getting to reconnect through another interview.
Yeah.
I have one final question for you today, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, I have, I think the last time you interviewed me, it was about a book in my Art Conservator mystery series.
Mm-hmm.
Lily Sparks is the heroine. She's a paintings conservator. So I've got the third installment in the Lily Sparks mysteries coming up, and it's going to come out this fall. It's called Object Lessons. And are you in Chicago?
I am, yes.
Okay, well, you may know of this. You know, there are miniature museums there and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, I don't know if you know what crime scene dioramas are, but they were pioneered in the 1940s by a Chicago heiress named Frances Glessner Lee. And what she did was she created these dollhouses as training tools for crime scene investigators. So they're dioramas, you know, like the miniature dollhouses. I think you have a big miniature dollhouse museum in Chicago. They're like those dollhouses, but of course the dolls in them are dead.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know.
That sounds so cool.
She was great. She was so eccentric, but she was such a pioneer. And she designed about 40 of them, I think, or maybe 20 or 40, I can't remember. I think it's more like 20 or something. And they're big, you know, they're 2 by 3 feet, and they're very, very detailed. And she created them to be a training tool for crime scene investigators. So, you know, the investigators would come and they'd look at the dollhouse and they'd have to sort of piece together the clues that she had planted in the dollhouses. So
that is the coolest thing I've ever heard. And
I know.
After COVID, I need to go there.
She was just wonderful. Anyway, so Object Lessons is kind of a modern take on crime scene dioramas. And it's set in Denver. So there are murders that echo the crime scene dioramas that are happening like in real time. So it was a really, really fun story to write.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited to read that one. I love the Lily Sparks books. So.
Oh, thank you.
They're so good. Yeah, I will be like first in line to buy that one.
Well, thanks a million.
Well, is there anything else?
No, people can, go on my website. It's writerkane.com. They can, if they want to contact me on Facebook, I love to have contacts. I always answer emails. My Facebook handle is, I think it's author Stephanie Kane. And I've got an Amazon page, an Amazon author page, and I'd love the contact.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll also have all that information in the notes, so anyone listening to this, depending on what service you are on, just scroll down and you'll see all of the social media handles.
Great.
Well, the one thing that I have to say is anyone listening to this who liked it, if you have not already, or even if you already have, go back and listen to my first interview with Stephanie Kane, because that one was also so amazing. She is incredible to talk to. Well, once again, thank you so much for Read Between the Lines. My name is Molly Southgate.
And I am Stephanie Kane.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.